Welcome to the Unshakable Foundation's meeting of Cocaine Anonymous. This is a main share meeting, and today it is with great pleasure and much gratitude that we welcome Barry, who has come to share on the topic, Thy Will Be Done, for up to 40 minutes. After, we will open up for the Q&A portion of the meeting. Barry, it's over to you.
Thanks. My name's Barry. I'm an addict. Thank you very much, everybody who's made it possible for this meeting to happen, and for the people who've asked me to be here and people who've encouraged me and stuff like that. Just a very small correction. The topic's Humbly Asked Him. Sorry about that. There's been some mix up over that. So yeah, Humbly Asked Him. First of all, a welcome to anybody who's new. You're very welcome here. I say that because people made me welcome at my first meeting, and that was what made the difference. That's what kept me coming back. And secondly, just to say that if you are having trouble with drink and drugs, we do have a solution. It might not make sense. It might be difficult to sort of get an idea of what's going on. But if you stick around and just listen to what people say and speak to people, you'll eventually get the hang of it, and it is possible to live a life, not a day, but a day at a time, not using. Life filled with hope, faith and courage, not just a life of misery, whether I'm using or whether I'm not using. I'm pretty nervous. I'm probably not as nervous as when I started, but I'm pretty nervous. And really, I just say that, not to excuse myself, but just so I'm not trying to be something that I'm not, Humbly asked him. Really, this is obviously that comes from the step 7 prayer, from step 7, humbly asked him to remove my shortcomings. But it's also, I wanted to share about humility, not because I'm humble, but because, but I've got experience of not being humble and what that means. And also, I guess, in a way that it's something that I see as sort of like something I aspire to, in a sense, something that I see as making a difference to me. Something that, ideally, I see it as one of the cornerstones of recovery in a way, even though, like I say, I'm not sure that I really have it. First of all, a joke about humility. There was an old timer who used to belong to this group, and be there 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. He'd pick up all the cigarette butts, he'd do all the washing up. And one week they gave him a medal for humility. The next week they took it off him because he wore it to the meeting. And that, to me, is like, that's the problem of humility. As soon as I think I've got it, I've lost it. So it's an ongoing thing, I'm not humble, but I'm more humble than I used to be. At least I'm less arrogant, less conceited than I used to be anyway, I also chose this topic because I guess I didn't want to get into too many theories and thinkings, In the end, I'd really rather stick to my experience, strength and hope, such as it is. Starting off with my experience, I've actually don't normally do this, but I've actually written notes for some of this. So yeah, my experience is that I first came into 12-step fellowship when I was in 1991. I was in treatment for a year, came out of treatment and I engaged with AA in treatment, came out of treatment and got involved with AA. And I was 20 years sober, and then I relapsed, and I look at, when I look at what were the reasons why I relapsed, I can sort of think of that in terms of humility, First of all, when I got out of treatment, I guess in a way I'd done the first 3 steps in treatment. I did a step 4 and 5 with somebody, but I didn't get a sponsor. And then after that, I did the steps my own way. Step 6 and 7 were about just saying sorry. Step 6 and 7 were about trying to be a nicer person, particularly with my mum. Steps 8 and 9 was about choosing who I was going to be sorry, choosing who I was going to say sorry to, and try and, just not exactly set things right, but just at least have some sort of like contact to put in the past at rest, particularly those people in some way that I wanted to still continue in contact with. And steps 10, 11 and 12, I guess in a way were just about me getting involved in the fellowship, and slowly raising my profile, and becoming accepted, being recognised, getting acclaim, all those sorts of things. So I didn't finish the steps properly. I didn't have a proper sponsor. I went about 3 or 4 years, and slowly got my life back together, went back to college, but there was other addictive behaviour that came into my life, which I was never well, at first I wasn't happy with. But nonetheless, I just let it develop. I didn't know what to do with it. That addictive behaviour was around women, and it led to me seeing escorts on a really regular basis. And very much addictive behaviour. There'd be times when I didn't want to do it, and then I would do it. There'd be times when I didn't have the money, but I'd find the money to spend it. There'd be times when I'd do it and I'd know it was going to make me feel bad, and then I'd carry on doing it. It was very much that sort of addictive behaviour. And it went on for a long time. We're not just talking about, a couple of times. It went on for 15 years, and this was when I was not drinking. This was when I was not using. You can't have a spirit. I can't have a spiritual life. I can't have some sort of like, make spiritual progress if I'm doing something that deep down inside that I think is wrong. And that's what I did, that was what was going on. At first, I tried to sort it out in various ways. I went to different fellowships. I went and had some sort of like psychoanalysis type thing. But for me, all that did in the end was sort of get me to a place where I just learned to live with it, and thought it was okay. I thought it was okay to do that. I thought I'm not harming anybody else. I'm not harming me. And I thought it was okay. But like I say, it meant that, my spiritual foundation was like, very, very shaky, very, very rocky. My life improved incredibly. I'd stopped drinking, and so, when I was using and drinking before, it was very much, I was like a hand to mouth, addict, alcoholic. My gyro check would arrive. I'd spend it in 3 or 4 days. And then it would be the rest of the 2 weeks trying to sort of get by, however. Then the next gyro check would arrive, and I'd do the same again. So, my life was never sort of like manageable at all. And, just on the organised side of it, being able to just live financially, being able to live, have, budget, or all those sorts of things. Once I stopped drinking, I become much, much more competent. I get a job, I keep a job, I get another better job. I slowly sort of like get sort of things together. I ended up owning a flat and stuff like that, so that my life was much, much better on the outside, and in a sense I could look at myself and I could say to other people, look how well I've done. All this is inflating myself. I'm gaining my self-worth from showing people that I am doing better. No humility. Look how well I've done. But all that, it's not that I'd had a spiritual awakening. All that had happened is that I'd become much more competent. And so I could keep going, I could function. Whereas before, when I was using, I couldn't function at all. I am not a functioning addict alcoholic. I'm not sure if there is one actually, but anyway, I'm certainly not one. As soon as I start using, everything else goes out the window. And that's the way. That's how I'd been before I came in. I'm not one of those, like I said, I came into AA out of treatment, or I went to AA meetings in treatment, and then I kept coming to meetings out of treatment. And I'm not one of those people who relapse because they stopped going to meetings. Literally the day before I relapsed, that night I was in a meeting as a secretary, just, doing the things that a secretary does. But all the service that I did, And really what I'm talking about is, what are the signs of the relapse? What are the signs that I was not working this program? Why did I relapse? Um, all the service I did was in some way, it was for some sort of like self-validation, so that people would say to me, well done, you're doing a good job. People would look up to me and I'd get that respect. And, and acclaim I was looking for as well. I was looking to be the best. I was looking to be the best secretary, all those sorts of things. But deep down inside, again, it's like I was getting my self-worth from that recognition. It wasn't from anything that was inside. I hadn't had that spiritual awakening. I wasn't able to be comfortable with myself. I wasn't able to be comfortable with my higher power. Um, I stopped being grateful. You know, uh, if I'm humble, I realise that I'm not doing it myself, and I'm grateful to my higher power that's come into my life. I stopped being grateful. I quite literally, I would never have said it, but I took it for, I would never have said, "Oh, I'm not going to drink again," because I knew that's not the sort of thing you say. But that was and I'm not sure I would have even said it to myself, to be honest. But deep down inside, there was that assumption that, I hadn't used. I hadn't used yesterday. I hadn't used last week. I hadn't used last year, and so on. I hadn't used 5 years ago. I hadn't used 10 years ago, so I'm not going to use today. And it was just like that, I remember thinking one time, I'm not going to use again because I've got too much to lose. And that's just like where that came from. I just don't know. That never, losing something never stopped me using in the past. But somehow, I just got this attachment to this new life, which included the fellowship, but it didn't include a spiritual awakening. It didn't include conscious contact, real conscious contact with a higher power. And it wasn't, it sounds like, well, yeah, I mean, it sounds like I was going around being really false. I was, I was, in a sense, I was a real fraud, but I certainly didn't know that for myself, I thought I was doing very well. Thank you very much. You know, like I say, I was taking my sobriety for granted. Um, the day that I relapsed, um, for me, I'm like Fred in the book. I didn't see my relapse coming. Like I said, I did have a good friend who I spoke to. I called him a sponsor, but he wasn't a sponsor. I just called him a sponsor so I could say I had a sponsor. But he did know a lot about me, and he knew about what was going on in my life at the time. I got involved with one of these women that I was seeing. It brought out all the sort of like emotional codependency that I have inside me. And as a result, I got, John, my sponsor, my friend then, he's now my sponsor, John, he said to me, the first drug you took was this woman, um, getting involved with her and staying involved with her, and I was with her one night. We were going to spend the night together, which didn't happen that often. I bought her some cocaine, and she was using. I'd been in this situation before where she was using cocaine, and just out of the blue, I said, I'll have a line. She gave me the mirror, and I just did this line, and it's like, it's like I had never taken. It's like I'd never stopped. Um, I took that line, and it wasn't immediately, but what's the next thing I did? Basically, well, it was immediate, but I wasn't aware of it. Immediately the physical allergy kicked in, because what was the next thing I did? I did another line, by the end of the night, within 2 or 3 hours, we're starting to run out of cocaine. And all I could think about is, when can we score again? Can we give, it's 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning? Can we give this guy a ring? Can we get some more? Can we get some more cocaine? And I had a 3 day binge, and I remember, oh gosh, God, I remember, I was going back to work after the 3 days. It was the Tuesday morning, I think, after a bank holiday. And I used to get up really early and the phone rang and it was 7 o'clock and it was like, where are you? You're not at work. And it was, it's like I was right back to those days, that unmanageable period, sort of like I said, just waking up and, waiting for the gyro to come. Obviously the circumstances were different, but it was just like suddenly I was rushing around, I had to rush and I had to have a quick wash and shave. I had to shoot into London, drive into London as quickly as possible. Um, I had to put on this false front, of I'm okay when really I wasn't. I managed to stop for 6 weeks. And like I say, the physical allergy kicked in straight away. It was obvious because I kept on using for 3 days. I went on the 3-day binge. The mental obsession was less obvious, but it kicked in for the whole of 6 weeks. And all the time I was thinking in my head, can I see, all I wanted to do was get some more cocaine and spend another weekend with this woman. And I kept on trying not to do it. And I kept on saying no. I spoke to John about it. He told me, it was insane. He told me it was a crazy idea. And when he said that, I could see that. But as soon as I put the phone down to him, he, the idea would come back again, and it was just going round and round in my head. And 6 weeks later, I did get some cocaine. We got a big bag of cocaine. We spent the weekend together, and I never went back to work. Like I said, I'm not a functioning addict. Once I start, I had a week of using when I wasn't at work, and once I started using again, the weekend ended. I was supposed to go back to work. I went back that first day, and again trying to pretend that I was normal. When I was just like, I was, I wasn't off my face like really high. I was trying to be as, I wasn't I was dabbing cocaine to keep me going, but I wasn't snorting it because I didn't want to get too high and didn't want to get too sort of like out of my head in some way. But just, completely disconnected from what I was supposed to be doing. And all I had on was this false front. And for all that I'd found difficult, I hadn't been like that at work anyway. I hadn't been like that at work before. And made some excuse, and went away and drove back to London, drove back to where I was living up in Hertfordshire. And, on the way, I did as much cocaine as I could. And I thought I was going to be okay. That sense of sort of like Bill when he rose to Canada, I'm going to be okay. I never went back to work again. For me, the physical obsession, the physical allergy, the mental obsession, they became the same thing basically. I just wanted to use. I did use. I used non-stop. I had, this time I wasn't waiting for the gyros to come in. I was going to the bank and cashing in savings and stuff like that, so I was using every day. I wasn't streetwise or anything like that. I used tens of thousands of pounds in a short time. Not because I was using, partly because I was getting ripped off, partly because of, I just didn't know what was going on around me, and that relapse lasted 7 weeks. And at the end of 7 weeks, I committed a serious crime and I ended up in prison. And I lost everything. I literally lost everything. That's not quite true. I lost an awful lot. I lost all those things around me that I was basing my self-worth on. I lost, the respect of the people that I knew. I lost my job. I'd lost my money. I lost my flat. I lost my friends. I lost that relationship with that woman who's, even though it was a sick relationship, another indication of how spiritually unwell I was is that I had another relationship going on as well, and I lost that. And it was like, I was just like, I didn't know what had happened to me, and there was all like the inside stuff as well, I was disgusted with myself. Other people were disgusted with me. I couldn't believe that the things that had happened had happened. I couldn't believe that I had done the things that I had done. I couldn't believe that the people I'd hurt, the people I had hurt. That's not quite true, I did believe it because I saw it, but I just didn't understand it. People talk about, they used to look, they look in the mirror. They couldn't look in the mirror. People said they couldn't look in the mirror. That was not my problem. I've always been able to look in the mirror, probably again because of lack of humility. 9 times I'll look at the mirror and think, I'm doing okay. I look really good, even now, as an old man. But what did happen, and I remember being in prison, trying to shave with these plastic mirrors because they won't let you have any glass. So the face is distorted, but just I was looking at myself and, I didn't know who I was, the face in the mirror was the same, yet all these things, I had the consequences of all my actions. I'd done all the things that I'd done. I was in this position I was in. I felt completely like lost and in despair, hopeless and helpless. And I just didn't, I was looking at myself in the mirror and thinking, well, who am I? I just didn't know who I was at all, For me, this humility certainly comes in part through humiliation, there's no doubt about that. I was completely humiliated. I wasn't able to stand up in front of people, and metaphorically hold my head up. I just didn't believe that I was had anything anything left. I was empty. I remember being in this prison cell, reading the Bible, trying to, like I say, I said I lost everything, and then I corrected myself. One of the things I didn't lose was I didn't lose that idea of a higher power. I might not have had conscious contact with my higher power. I might not have had a spiritual awakening, but at least I had some awareness of a higher power. I didn't lose that. And, there was nowhere else to go but to go back to that higher power. For me, it was around sort of, like I say, reading the Bible. And I remember reading this Bible. It was Matthew's Gospel. I can picture it now, the cell with the lights off and stuff, just one light on, and feeling completely empty, and just feeling absolutely nothing at all, and just a sense that, I was not getting any comfort from my higher power. Yeah, I look at that time now and, I see that actually that my higher power was in the emptiness, something that I heard somebody say once, which just, means, it just seems to sum it up for me, I used to think that I was too broken to get recovery when the truth was I wasn't broken enough, and at that point with that emptiness, in one sense I was starting to get broken, I still used again, I still had the mental obsession. I still had I still had the mental obsession. I didn't have the physical allergy, and I remember some cocaine coming on the wing, and, that mental obsession, cocaine had completely destroyed my life. I was still waiting to go to court, so I had no idea what was going on about my sentencing. They had random drug tests at any time, everything was saying, don't use, don't use, don't use. My head was saying to myself, don't use, don't use, don't use. And, what did I do? Of course, I went and scored. And the last time I used was in prison. I did one line of this cocaine and I got the physical effect. It worked. My skin started tingling. My hair stood up. The lights got brighter. And yet I didn't get any sort of escape at all. I remember, I was in this prison cell looking through the window, through the bars, through the window. And I was next to this alleyway where the people who worked in the offices, the admin offices, on a Friday afternoon were going home. And it was like, I was completely separate from life. Life was going on and I was completely separate from it, And again, it was like, it didn't take away that emptiness, why do we, why do I use, why does anybody use, I think, when we talk about the real addict, real alcoholic, we're using to fill up that emptiness inside us, and because, for a long time drugs work and then suddenly drugs stop. Well, then for me, the drugs stopped working, like I say, they worked physically, they had an effect on my metabolism, but they didn't have any effect on my heart at all. They didn't have any effect on my soul. It didn't fill up that hole. It just made it bigger. I just looked and all I could see was, everything that I thought cocaine and drugs was going to give me. And this is going back over sort of 40 years, The first time I used was when I was 15 years old. I remember taking LSD in the park and thinking, it gave me something I didn't know I was looking for. And that this is the answer to sort of like life, life that I had found in some way meaningless and empty, even at 15 years old. Suddenly it wasn't like that, and all the things that I thought that the drugs were going to give me, excitement, meaning, girls, whatever it was, fun, all progress, all those things, it was never going to give it to me. I was just, all it was going to leave me with was this emptiness, that emptiness when I was reading the Bible, that emptiness when I was using, that emptiness that I had, because, all the self-worth, all the worth that I had, the way I validated myself was through other people, the fact that I was 20, 10 years sober, 15 years sober, 20 years sober, that was all gone, and that was, part of my step one for sure, um, and that was a gift, it was a grace, it really was a grace, God did for me what I could not do for myself, I'd spent the day before trying to think my way out of not using. I took that line, I saw that emptiness, I saw myself in a completely different way, and somebody offered me some cocaine the next day, and I just said no, and that doesn't mean that I'd found a solution. I was nowhere near finding a solution, but I had stopped believing that lie. I could say, um, I had to be humiliated to get the start of humility. Come on to what that is later. Um, in a way, that was step one. Step two, that idea of coming to believe. I think I've got this right. I remember reading somewhere that Bill said that all the traditions are an exercise in humility. And I guess in a way, all the steps are an exercise in humility as well. Maybe I've got that the wrong way round, but I think that's what I've read anyway. And I might come on to the traditions if I've got any time. I've got no idea how long I've been talking for. Um, yeah. All the steps are an exercise in humility. Just that idea I can't use, that idea I need to ask for help. Um, and it was like, all I needed to do was to be willing to believe. That idea that I could be willing to believe, that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. My problem was I did not believe I could be restored. Again, I was trying to think. I was thinking about this earlier. I was trying to think, what was it? That thing about, driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, and self-pity. I was terrified of like how what I was gonna. I was just full of fear. To be honest. Maybe I'll come back to the fear. The self-delusion. That self-delusion that I was so damaged that I couldn't get better. That in some way, in some way, I was so special and different that I couldn't get better. Self-seeking, there's that aspect of me that's an addict, that always wants to use, that's always looking at what I can get out of things, and the self-pity as well, that idea that I can't get better again it was full of that self-pity, Um, things that I had lost or I felt I had lost, actually I'd thrown them away. I was never going to get them back. And just that idea of taking a new, starting a new life, for me, it was really, really difficult to come back after 20 years, and begin to sort of feel that this program could work for me. In my experience, in terms of other people that I've seen as well, people who've had 5, 10 years and then they relapse again. It's very, they find it very hard to come back. Like I say, I found it incredibly hard. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that it's really difficult to let go. All I had was my old experience of recovery, and it was so difficult to let go of it. I mean, I wasn't in recovery anymore. I didn't have 20 years anymore, but at least I'd had 20 years once, and at least I knew about something. I could talk, or at least I could talk about something, and and that prayer that helped me set aside everything I think I know about myself. That was I didn't know that prayer at that time, but that was the problem. I couldn't set aside everything I think I knew about myself because I had nothing. So what I thought I knew was I had to cling on to as much as possible because I seemed to have nothing else. Again, that idea of I had to be broken, I had to be completely broken. I thought I was too broken when I wasn't broken enough. And how did I come to believe? Definitely one of the ways I came to believe was by having support. I spoke about my friend John. He lived up in Scarborough. He was coming down to Hertfordshire once a month, and every month he would come and see me. He would go out of his way on his journey down, and he would come and see me, and spend time with me. He would come and visit me, and he did that for 4 years. I had that support. I might have been selfish and self-centered, but he showed me somebody who wasn't selfish and self-centered, and I came to believe in that, I guess, in a little way. We had AA meetings in the prison once a week, and I remember I used to go along to these meetings and I used to talk about where I was at, and where I was at was full of self-pity, like I said, Sorry, just lost my train of thought. I used to talk about where I was at and just the negativity in my life. And every day I would get up and just say my prayers. Like I said, I hadn't lost my higher power. I was doing the things I wanted, I was supposed to be doing, trying to do the things I was supposed to be doing, which was really just steps 1 and 2, admitting I was broken and then asking for help. But not believing that I would get help, and just keeping on doing that every day, day in, day out, I guess I'd got involved with something called the RAT program. So and that sort of involved doing the 5 steps, not the way we do them, not as a sponsor, but as a group. But at least I was doing something, but I was still really living in step 2, I was still waiting for that coming to believe, and I don't know how it happened. What I do know is there was one day we were at this meeting, and I was sharing again, as going around the room like you do, and I was sharing something like positive. I can't remember what it was. It was just something about, being out in the gardens and enjoying the work I was doing or something like that. And, but I remembered noting, God, is this me talking? Am I actually being positive about the present, about the future, I used to say, like I said, full of self-delusion and self-pity. I used to say I had 3 problems. One was the past because of the shame I had and all the things I'd lost. One was the present because I hated being in prison and I couldn't handle it very well. And then the other was the future because I didn't know what was going to happen when I left, or when I was going to leave and stuff like that. And trying to just let go of that control, I guess, I eventually got away, I eventually got left prison, and I did step 3 in my sponsor's car outside the hostel where I was, and it was like, what are you going to do different today? Nobody actually said that to me, thank goodness. But, I said it to myself. And like the first thing I was going to do was I was going to do the steps properly. And, I went through, I remember going to my first CA meeting, apart from the one or two that had been in prison, and being welcomed by somebody at that first meeting. And I was familiar with the fellowship, I was familiar with how the meetings went, but going to that CA meeting the first time, and my friend, my mate called Phil, shaking my hand and bringing me into the room, all of that, I was still very broken inside. I was still very unsure of myself, but it didn't matter. I didn't need to be the secretary anymore. I was just grateful to have a job washing up. And washing up was brilliant for me because, I still found it, I felt, I'd lost so much of sense of myself and who I was that I found it hard to talk to people. And just making the tea was like brilliant, because I could talk to people, for 3 or 4 minutes. What do you want? A cup of tea? Have a little chat about how they were, and then they'd go on, and somebody else would come along, And it was just, just that being of service. Thank you for allowing me to be of service. I spoke about when I was secretary before. I used to think being of service was about, making me feel good. I didn't understand that being of service was about, what could I possibly do for other people. Trying to go very quickly through the steps in terms of humility, in a lot. I don't know if it is humility, obviously steps 4 and 5 and having to talk to somebody about the things I've done, the resentments I have, the fears I have, my sex conduct. Let's not go there. Obviously that's very difficult, but I'm not sure that's not self-centered shame. I'm not sure that is humility. Steps 8 and 9, having to go and, speak, make those amends properly. Not just say sorry, but make those amends properly as well as I'm able, trying to set right the past as well as I can. I guess that does involve humility actually, because that's not just about shame, but there is that difficulty and that awkwardness, at least there was for me, just that fear that I've got to break through, which is very much again self-centered, But then, 6, obviously the humbly asked him, steps 6 and 7. Like I say, I've chose that really because I just wanted to talk about humility and, particularly that it was lack of humility that led to my relapse. It's only since then that I've been thinking about it, in terms of what does it mean, humility. And it's about, one of the things I've thought about is when I'm talking about humbly asking to remove my shortcomings, I'm standing, kneeling for me. Why do I kneel in front of my God? I kneel to show myself that I mean it. I don't kneel for God, I kneel for myself. I kneel because in a way, the God as I see him, yes, he's close to me. I am a child, as it says in the book, we are children of a loving creator, a living creator. And I can have a relationship with simple and understandable terms. But nonetheless, at times, just kneeling occasionally, just to show myself that he is God and I'm not, is appropriate. It seems like the right thing to do. I don't say all my prayers on my knees. Nowadays, I'm living in the north of Scotland. I don't have any heating in my house, and when I wake up in the mornings, it's really cold, and I say my prayers. I say the first set of prayers in my under the duvet. But I do sit up straight at least anyway, and I do eventually get out of bed. God, I offer myself to the, sorry, wrong prayer, isn't it? My Creator, I am now ready that you should have all of me, good and bad. Yes, I used to put a front on to people. I'm sure I used to put a front on to God, and I try and stop doing that now. I offer myself to thee. Sorry, I'm getting my prayers muddled up. This is nerves, excuse me. My Creator, I'm now ready that you should have ordered me good and bad. Take away from me now, I pray, every single defect of character that stands in the way of my usefulness of you and my fellows. It's not about getting rid of these defects for me. It's about getting rid of these defects for other people, Humility in some ways about, that right relationship with a higher power. Steps 10, still humility, try and keep myself right with the world, Step 11, try and keep myself right with my higher power. And step 12, having had a spiritual awakening finally, if I have, I can never count on it. Having had a spiritual awakening, I try and practice, I try and carry this message to the still suffering addict and practice these principles in all my affairs. I don't get sober for myself. I guess if you wanted, what was one difference about my attitude? I got, 25, whenever it was now, 1991, I got sober for myself. I don't get sober for myself. Yes, I have a good life, but I don't get sober for myself. I will finish on this, like I say, every morning I get down on my knees. What did I learn from that relapse? I was listening to something somewhere where somebody said there's always growth in a relapse. You can always learn from a relapse so long as you come back, What did I learn from that relapse? One thing definitely I learned is that, I could use today, I cannot be sure that I'm not going to use today unless I have that conscious contact with my higher power, and keep in fit spiritual condition. So I do get down on my knees, nearly every day, and I say, dear God, please keep me away from a drug and a drink and other types of addictive behaviour just for today. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Hi, Dave, recovered alcoholic addict.
Hi,
Barry,
Dave.
thank you very much for that share. That was absolutely amazing. I related to so much of it. I relapsed after 4.5 years of recovery myself, and I noticed the same sort of thing. I was ticking boxes with property and prestige, and then once that everything was ticked off, I went back out there. I noticed I didn't grow spiritually, the whole time. And the question I got for you, I've got multiple questions, but I'm going to narrow it down to just this one question, which is like a double question. When you came back from your relapse, what practice did you do in particular to enlarge your spiritual life, and what do you think was the most effective thing for you to build that conscious contact with your Creator?
I love my morning routine nowadays. I get up, I set my alarm for 5 o'clock in the morning, and which is very early, do it partly because I do, and I just love that quiet time when there's nothing around, and I can just do my readings. My readings are based around, I'm connected to a church, and they're based around that, and I incorporate the AA stuff into it as well, and just having that whole quiet time where, it is quiet time, it includes meditation, it includes prayer, but it is just about that quiet time, and having that there when I might be worrying about things, but in some way I'm worrying about those things with my higher power. There's something, I was thinking about sharing, actually it's a bit different because I had a bit of a different day today. But, there's been times when I've been sort of worrying about this share and just sort of thinking, well, I spend that time with my higher power. But it's a program of action, I love meetings, I know meetings don't keep me sober, but where else can you go and get, recovery, unity and service, given to me on a plate, going to, I go to meet, I'm older, I'm retired now, I don't work, I don't have family, I go to meetings most days of the week, and service as well, That's that, what's the thing I don't know if it's quite answering your question. What's the thing that's made the difference? It's certainly service, I got involved in service in a way I never had done. I wasn't self-serving, I did things because they needed to be done and people asked me to, or I saw they needed to be done. Most effective in terms of contact with that higher power. Like I say, I love that quiet time. I love that, that peace, that prayer, that sort of that thing. Thank you very much for your question, Dave.
Thank you so much. And Isaac, come on in, please.
Thank you, Tanya. Hi, everyone. My name's Isaac. I'm a recovered addict. Thank you, everyone, being in the service. And Barry, thank you so much for coming and speaking for us today. Really enjoyed listening to you, and yeah, really appreciated. My question is, someone like yourself who spent a lot of time in the meeting space for those couple of decades, although you might not have been working a program, was there an aspect of when you had a genuine experience through the steps? Was there an aspect of the program or the steps you had a bit of challenge of having an open mind and a new experience around, considering you spent a lot of time, I guess, with people who were in the meeting and step space in your previous recovery? Thanks.
Um, when I came out of treatment, and I said I did, I tried to do a step four. I did do a step 4 and 5. I found somebody to do a step 4 and 5 with. Um, I was being genuine there, and I did it as well as I could at the time. Yeah, and I had this idea that because he did this chap that did it, because he did my step 4 and 5 with me, he was going to be my sponsor. And he wasn't. He just did see, as far as he was concerned, he was just doing his step 4 and 5. And I didn't ask him. I didn't ask him. I don't. It was something about expectations and stuff like that, and I just didn't ask him. I hadn't surrendered to the program. I'd surrendered to my illness. I had a bad time before I came in 1991. That's what, psychiatric hospital, all those sort of things. Obviously I was I was a proper addict, alcoholic. But I was still full of self-pity and all that sort of stuff as well, and it was all around, that first time that brought me in was again around a codependent relationship. I had surrendered to my illness, but I hadn't sort of like surrendered to the solution. Obviously I got things from doing it, but like I say, they were the wrong things. I was getting that recognition. It did give me a contact. It gave me an awareness of a higher power. It gave me some friendship. I met my friend John. That's how I met my friend John and other people. So it did give me that side of things. But it wasn't like, I just hadn't surrendered to, I hadn't surrendered to that either. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but, those are some of my thoughts anyway.
Thank you for your question. And Danny, come on in, please.
Thanks, Tanya. Hi, guys. I'm Danny. I'm an addict. And Barry, thank you so much. What an amazing story. My question for you is, and you said this in your share, and I love what you said when you said God is in the emptiness, and I love that. And our book says, doesn't it, God is either everything or else he is nothing. So my question to you is, after them 20 years in that relapse, and when you did, was there like a moment where you saw God's hand in that relapse, because clearly, you didn't have that will. So was there a moment where you saw God in that relapse? And I know it must have been difficult, after 20 years coming back. So yeah, thank you.
Did I see when did I see God in that relapse? Not at the time, for sure. Like I said, in that prison cell, all I felt was nothing. If you like, it's only in retrospect I look at it and I can see, and it's like the footsteps prayer. I was being carried. But looking, obviously, so it's in looking back on it that I see that. I'm trying to think when would be the first time that it really hit me, just having that sense of a higher power. I know there was, I'm using a previous experience as well, but, there came a point when, I could look at my life and I could, be grateful for where I was. I remember, like I say, I went to a hostel. Then I was then I was being really strictly monitored by probation and stuff like that. And after about a year and a half, I eventually went on holiday, and I go cycling. I go touring on my bicycle, And I was away I went up to Derbyshire to the Peak District. And while I was there, I phoned up somebody from the fellowship, just somebody I knew, and telling him that I was away on holiday. And he was really pleased for me, just that after everything that I'd been through and all the places that I'd been, that I could actually do that life, and just realizing that, it was, I was being reborn, I guess, I was having that new life, That's very much about self as well, isn't it? I can just act. It's just like I can look back on actions now. I'm thinking like, I was at a meeting and somebody asked. Sorry, I'm trying to say this very quickly. I was at a meeting and they were asking for people to do service at sort of area and district, and it's like I didn't want to, but I just had this thought, if I really am grateful, and I am grateful, then I ought to be able to put myself out for it. And looking back now, I can see like the higher power in that. I guess it's just looking back now, in all those events of my life, I can, all those events of like the last, whatever it is now, 14 years, I can see my higher power in it.
Thank you for that. And our last question of the evening is Michael, coming in.
Hi Tanya, thank you, and thank you Barry for your share. I was expecting a chat with a Scottish accent for one reason or another, but it was wonderful, mate. It was very honest, and it was actually full of humility, which was a wonderful experience. So my question is, and I didn't really want to focus on the relapse because I think there was a lot within your share, but we hear a lot in the rooms, people. The most important person in the room is the newcomer, and the most important person is the person in the first 30 days. What would your advice be to somebody who is in their last 30 days, who's maybe got an established time and can't see the walls coming down around them? What would your advice
So
be?
in their first 30 days or something?
In their last 30 days. So they might have like some established clean time, like you had 20 years. What would you have said to yourself in your last 30 days before you relapsed, if you could have said?
God, what a question.
Sorry.
What would I? Please listen to me. I know you're not going to listen to me. I know your mind is closed, but please listen to me, I guess what I'd say now is, look, I was 20 years clean and I didn't think I'd use again, and I did, and that it just, it can, clean time it can happen. Yeah. I just finished very briefly as well. Like I've shared about this at times, and people think, oh, 20 years, and so what's the point? Relapsed again. I mean, this is a message of hope. I'm 14 years clean and sober now, and well, I would never call myself a recovered addict personally. It's just I know what people mean, recovered a day at a time, all of that. I understand all that. And I'm not saying that people are wrong, but for myself, I always want to remember that, today I could drink and use, and in that sense, I can get, I can get full of myself. That's why I need humility. I need to remember I am an addict, not that I am a recovered addict.
That was great.